Jacob Miller spent his last $8 on a wild colt that was more dead than alive, its skin rotting off in patches as it trembled in the auction pen. The crowd laughed at the limping veteran buying a dying horse, never imagining they were witnessing the beginning of an impossible journey to championship glory. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The autumn wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant rain across the forgotten edges of Montana, where the land stretched wide and unforgiving. It was here, on the outskirts of a small town that barely appeared on most maps, that Jacob Miller lived in a trailer that had seen better decades. The metal siding was rusted in places, and the steps leading to the door creaked with every footfall. But it was home. More accurately, it was all he had left after coming back from overseas with a Purple Heart, a limp that never quite healed, and memories that visited him most nights whether he wanted them or not. Jacob was 42 years old, though some days he felt twice that age. His hair, once dark and thick, had gone gray at the temples, and his hands bore the scars of both war and the hard labor he took on whenever he could find it. He worked odd jobs around town, fixing fences, hauling feed, doing whatever people needed done for whatever they could pay. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. The VA checks helped, but they were never quite enough, and the medical bills from his leg surgeries had eaten through what little savings he once had. Still, Jacob never complained. Complaining didn't fix anything, and if the military had taught him one thing, it was that you kept moving forward no matter how heavy the weight on your shoulders. That particular morning, Jacob woke before dawn, as he always did. Sleep was unreliable, coming in fits and starts, interrupted by dreams of sand and smoke. He made himself a cup of instant coffee on the small electric burner, black and bitter, and stood at the window looking out at the emptiness beyond. There was something peaceful about the land at this hour, before the world woke up and reminded him of everything he'd lost. His wife had left 3 years after he came home, unable to bear the silence that had settled between them like a wall he couldn't tear down. His daughter lived 2 states away and called once a month, their conversations polite and distant. He didn't blame them. He knew what he'd become. Around mid-morning, Jacob drove his battered pickup truck into town. The engine made a rattling sound that worried him, but he didn't have money for a mechanic, so he just turned up the radio and hoped it would last a few more months. He needed to pick up some supplies from the hardware store and see if Old Man Henderson had any work for him this week. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and while some people looked at him with pity, others simply looked through him as though he were already a ghost. He preferred the latter. Pity made him feel smaller than he already did. As he passed the livestock auction grounds on the edge of town, he noticed a small crowd gathering. Curiosity pulled at him, and though he knew he had no business being there, he found himself parking and walking over. The auction was just starting, and a tired-looking auctioneer was calling out prices for various animals, horses mostly, and some cattle. Jacob leaned against the wooden fence, watching without really seeing, his mind elsewhere. Then he heard the murmurs. People were pointing and shaking their heads at something being led into the pen. Jacob's eyes focused, and what he saw made his chest tighten. It was a colt, maybe a year old, but you could hardly tell what it was supposed to look like. Its coat was patchy, covered in what appeared to be mange or some other skin disease. Raw red patches showed through where the hair had fallen out, and the animal was so thin that its ribs stood out like prison bars. Its eyes, though, were what caught Jacob's attention. They were wild and frightened, rolling back as it pulled against the rope, and in them Jacob saw something he recognized: terror, pain, the desperate need to escape from something it couldn't name. The auctioneer barely tried. His voice was flat, resigned. "All right, folks, we've got this colt here. Young, wild, Got some skin condition that'll need treatment. Looking for any takers. Let's start at $50. Silence. Not a single hand went up. The crowd seemed to collectively turn away, as if the sight of the animal was too depressing to acknowledge. 40? The auctioneer tried again. Still nothing. Come on, folks, somebody give me a bid. 20? Jacob felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was irrational and foolish, and he had no business even thinking about it. He could barely afford to feed himself, let alone a sick animal that would need veterinary care and proper food. But those eyes, those wild, terrified eyes that looked just like his own when he stared in the mirror on the bad days. $10, someone called out mockingly. A few people laughed. The auctioneer sighed. Come on now, this is a live animal. $10? Fine. 10 going once, going twice. $8. Jacob's voice cut through the air before he even realized he was speaking. Every head turned to look at him. The auctioneer raised an eyebrow. You serious, mister? Jacob swallowed hard. He had maybe $30 to his name until next week's check. $8 meant cutting into his food budget, meant going hungry for a few days. But he was already nodding. Yes, sir, $8. The auctioneer shrugged. Sold to the gentleman for $8. Sir, you just bought yourself one wild colt. May God have mercy on your soul. The reality of what Jacob had just done hit him the moment he handed over the crumpled bills to the auction clerk. $8. He'd just spent $8 he couldn't afford on an animal he had no way to properly care for. The woman behind the desk gave him a look that was equal parts sympathy and judgment as she counted the money twice, as if she couldn't quite believe someone had actually paid for that particular animal. She handed him a receipt and pointed toward the holding pens where the colt was waiting. Jacob folded the paper and stuck it in his pocket, his leg already aching from standing too long. He'd forgotten to take his medication that morning, and now the old injury was reminding him of that oversight. Walking toward the pen, Jacob could hear the colt before he saw it. The sound of hooves striking wood echoed across the grounds, violent and desperate. When he reached the enclosure, 2 ranch hands were trying to get a rope around the animal, but the colt was having none of it. It reared and kicked, its eyes rolling white with panic, and one of the men jumped back cursing when a hoof came too close to his head. The other man, older and more experienced, kept his distance and shook his head at Jacob. This your animal now? The man asked, his tone making it clear what he thought of that decision. Jacob nodded. Yes, sir, just bought him. The ranch hand spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Well, good luck with that. This one's mean, wild as they come. Been trying to handle him for the past week and he won't let nobody near him. Barely eats, bites at anyone who tries to feed him. Got that skin condition too, which probably hurts like hell. Makes him even more unpredictable. Jacob watched the colt thrashing in the pen. The animal's coat was worse up close. Patches of raw, inflamed skin covered its body, and in some places the skin looked infected, oozing and crusted over. The colt was so thin that every bone was visible, and its legs seemed too fragile to support even its emaciated weight. But what struck Jacob most was the fight still left in it. Despite everything, this animal hadn't given up. It was still fighting, still resisting, still trying to survive. I need to get him into my truck, Jacob said quietly. The ranch hand laughed without humor. Your truck? Mister, you got a horse trailer? No. Then how exactly do you plan on transporting a wild colt? Jacob hadn't thought that far ahead. He looked at his pickup truck parked across the lot, then back at the terrified animal. I'll figure it out. It took an hour and the help of 3 ranch hands to even get the colt near the truck. They used ropes and patience and a lot of careful maneuvering. The colt fought every step of the way, its hooves skidding on the ground, its body twisting and bucking. Jacob's leg was screaming by the time they managed to guide the animal into the truck bed. They'd put down a thick layer of hay and secured makeshift barriers on the sides to keep the colt from jumping out, though the ranch hands made it clear they thought the whole endeavor was insane. "He's gonna kick through that tailgate before you make it 5 miles, one of them warned. Jacob climbed into the driver's seat, his hands shaking slightly. Through the rearview mirror, he could see the colt's head, ears pinned back, body trembling. He started the engine slowly, not wanting to spook the animal any more than it already was. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of his life. He drove well under the speed limit, taking every turn with exaggerated care, constantly checking the mirror to make sure the colt was still there. A few times the animal tried to jump, its front hooves coming up against the barriers, but the makeshift pen held. When Jacob finally pulled onto the dirt road leading to his trailer, his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool autumn air. He had a small shed behind his trailer, nothing fancy, just a lean-to structure he'd built years ago with the vague idea of maybe getting some chickens someday. It would have to do. He parked as close to the shed as possible and sat for a moment, trying to figure out his next move. Getting the colt out of the truck proved almost as difficult as getting it in. The animal was exhausted from the fight and the journey, but it still had enough energy to resist. Jacob worked slowly, speaking in a low, steady voice even though he wasn't sure the colt could hear him over its own panic. Eventually, using a combination of patience and gentle pressure, he managed to guide the animal into the shed. The moment the colt was inside, it retreated to the farthest corner and stood there shaking, its eyes fixed on Jacob with a mixture of fear and defiance. Jacob secured the shed door and leaned against it, breathing hard. His leg was throbbing, and he could feel the old familiar ache spreading up into his hip. He needed to sit down, needed his medication, needed to think about what he was going to do next. But first he needed to make sure the colt had water. He found an old bucket, filled it from the hose, and carefully entered the shed. The colt immediately pressed itself harder against the wall, but Jacob set the bucket down near the entrance and backed away slowly. "It's all right," he said softly. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The colt stared at him, sides heaving, and Jacob realized with a sinking feeling that he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. That first night was brutal. Jacob sat on the steps of his trailer, listening to the sounds coming from the shed. The colt was restless, pacing back and forth in the confined space, occasionally kicking at the walls with sharp, violent strikes that made Jacob wince. Each impact sent a jolt through his chest, a reminder of his impulsive decision and his complete lack of preparation. He had no horse feed, no proper medical supplies, nothing that a responsible horse owner should have. All he had was stubbornness and a feeling he couldn't quite name that told him this animal needed him as much as he needed it. Around midnight, Jacob finally went inside and collapsed onto his narrow bed, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind raced with worries. What if the colt hurt itself? What if the skin condition was contagious or deadly? What if he'd just condemned this animal to a slower, more painful death than it would have faced at the auction? He stared at the water-stained ceiling of his trailer and thought about all the times in his life he'd made decisions without thinking them through. Enlisting at 18, volunteering for that extra deployment, believing he could come home and pick up where he left off. Each choice had seemed right in the moment, and each one had led him further down a path he never intended to walk. Before dawn broke, Jacob was up again. His body protested every movement, the combination of yesterday's exertion and a sleepless night making him feel decades older than his years. He made coffee and stood at the window, watching the first light creep across the empty land. The shed was quiet now, and he wondered if that was a good sign or a bad one. Taking a deep breath, he pulled on his worn jacket and headed outside. When he opened the shed door, he found the colt standing in the same corner. Though it looked somehow smaller in the morning light, its head was lowered, and the fight from yesterday seemed to have drained out of it overnight. Jacob could see more clearly now how bad the skin condition really was. The patches of missing hair revealed raw, inflamed flesh, and in some spots the skin looked crusty and infected. The smell hit him too, a sour, sickly odor that spoke of illness and neglect. The water bucket was untouched. Jacob's heart sank. He knew enough about animals to know that if this colt didn't drink soon, it would be in serious trouble. Dehydration on top of malnutrition and disease was a death sentence. He stepped inside slowly, keeping his movements small and unthreatening. The colt's head shot up, ears pinned back, and its body tensed as if preparing to bolt, though there was nowhere to go. "Easy now," Jacob murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you're scared. Trust me, I get it. But you need to drink something." He picked up the bucket and stepped back, setting it down closer to the colt, but not so close that the animal felt cornered. Then he retreated to the doorway and waited. Minutes passed. The colt didn't move. Jacob's leg was aching from standing, but he remained still, patient. He'd learned patience in the military, learned how to wait through discomfort and boredom and fear. This was just another kind of waiting. Finally, after what felt like an hour but was probably only 15 minutes, the colt took a tentative step forward. Then another. Its nostrils flared, testing the air, and slowly, carefully, it lowered its head to the bucket. Jacob held his breath. The colt sniffed the water, pulled back, then tried again. This time it drank. Just a few sips at first, then longer gulps. Relief flooded through Jacob so intensely he had to lean against the doorframe. That small victory gave him the courage to face the next challenge. He needed to feed this animal, and he needed to get that skin condition looked at. Neither of those things were possible without money he didn't have. Jacob went back into his trailer and did something he hadn't done in years. He called his daughter. Sarah answered on the fourth ring, her voice cautious. "Dad?" "Hey, sweetheart." Jacob cleared his throat, suddenly unsure how to explain. "I know it's early. I'm sorry to bother you." There was a pause. "Is everything okay? Are you all right?" "I'm fine. I need a favor. A small loan, maybe. I'll pay you back, I promise." Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, what's going on? Are you in trouble?" Jacob looked out the window toward the shed. "I did something stupid yesterday, bought a horse, well, a colt. It's sick and I don't have money for a vet or feed, and I know I shouldn't be asking you, but you bought a horse?" Sarah's voice held disbelief and something else. Concern, maybe, or disappointment. Jacob couldn't quite tell. "Dad, you can barely afford to take care of yourself. Why would you buy a horse?" It was a fair question, one Jacob had been asking himself since yesterday. "I don't know, Sarah. I saw it at the auction and it was in such bad shape and nobody wanted it, and I couldn't leave it there." He heard his daughter sigh on the other end of the line. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the unspoken words that had accumulated over the years. Finally, Sarah spoke. "How much do you need?" "Maybe 200 for a vet visit and some feed. I'll pay you back next month, I swear." "Don't worry about paying me back, Dad." Her voice was softer now. "I'll transfer it today, but please take care of yourself too, okay? Not just the horse." After they hung up, Jacob sat for a long moment with the phone in his hand. His daughter had said yes without making him feel smaller, without the lecture he probably deserved. That kindness felt like more than he'd earned. By afternoon, the money from Sarah had arrived in Jacob's account. He stood in line at the small-town bank, withdrew the cash, and felt the weight of it in his pocket like a responsibility he couldn't mess up. The nearest veterinarian was Dr. Ellen Reeves, a woman in her 50s who'd been treating animals in the area for nearly 3 decades. Jacob had never met her personally, but he'd heard she was fair and didn't charge more than what was necessary. He called from the payphone outside the grocery store, his hands fumbling with the coins. "Reeves Veterinary Clinic," a brisk voice answered. "Hi, my name is Jacob Miller. I've got a colt that needs medical attention. It's got some kind of skin disease, real bad, and it's malnourished. Can Dr. Reeves come take a look?" There was the sound of papers shuffling. "We don't usually do house calls for new clients, Mr. Miller. Can you bring the animal in?" Jacob thought about the chaos of getting the colt into his truck the first time. "It's wild. Untrained. I don't think I can transport it safely." A pause. "How wild are we talking?" "Won't let anyone near it. Kicks, bites, panics when you try to handle it." Another pause, longer this time. "Hold on." He heard muffled conversation, then the voice returned. "Dr. Reeves says she can come out tomorrow morning, around 9. But Mr. Miller, if this animal is dangerous, we may have to discuss other options." Jacob knew what other options meant. "It's not dangerous, just scared. I'll have it as calm as possible by tomorrow." After hanging up, Jacob drove to the feed store and bought a small bag of horse feed, some hay, and a mineral block. The clerk, a young guy with a name tag that read Danny, helped him load everything into the truck. "You got yourself a horse?" Danny asked, making conversation. "A colt. Needs some work." Danny grinned. "Don't they all? My dad's got 3 at his place. They're a lot of work, but worth it, you know. There's something about horses. They got souls, if that makes sense." Jacob nodded, though he wasn't sure if it made sense or not. He'd never thought much about animal souls. But as he drove home, he found himself hoping Danny was right. Back at the trailer, Jacob approached the shed with the feed bucket in hand. The colt was standing in its corner again, but this time its ears flicked forward slightly when Jacob appeared. It was a small sign, barely noticeable, but Jacob took it as progress. He poured some feed into a pan and set it down near where he'd placed the water, then backed away to his usual spot by the door. This time, the colt moved toward the food more quickly. It sniffed cautiously, then began to eat, tentatively at first, then with more urgency. Jacob watched, feeling that same rush of relief he'd felt when the colt drank water. These tiny victories felt enormous, like he was winning a war one small battle at a time. "That's it," he said softly. "Get your strength back." Over the next few hours, Jacob made multiple trips to check on the colt. Each time, he stayed a little longer, talking in that same low, steady voice. He didn't say anything important, just narrated what he was doing, or commented on the weather, or shared random thoughts that popped into his head. The colt seemed to tolerate his presence a bit more each visit, though it still pressed against the far wall and watched him with wary eyes. As evening approached, Jacob pulled an old camping chair from his trailer and set it up outside the shed door, leaving it open so he could see inside. He sat down with a can of soup he'd heated on the burner and ate slowly, watching the colt watch him. The animal had eaten most of the feed and drunk more water, which Jacob counted as another win. Its sides still heaved with nervous breaths, but there was something different in its posture now, less rigid, less ready to explode into panic. "You know something?" Jacob said between bites of soup. "I've been thinking about what to call you. Can't just keep saying the colt forever. Seems disrespectful." He paused, considering. "You're a fighter. Been through hell and you're still standing. Still got that fire in you." Another pause. "My unit in Afghanistan, we had this saying. Against all odds. That's what we told ourselves when things got bad. When it seemed like we wouldn't make it through another day. Against all odds." He looked at the colt, who was watching him with those dark, liquid eyes. "How about odds? That work for you?" The colt didn't respond, of course, but it didn't look away either. Jacob decided to take that as acceptance. That night, Jacob slept better than he had in weeks. He dreamed, but for once they weren't the usual nightmares of sand and explosions. Instead, he dreamed of open fields and running horses, of freedom and wind and space that went on forever. When he woke before dawn, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite hope, but maybe the shadow of it, the possibility of something good. He went outside to check on odds and found the colt lying down in the hay, its head resting on the ground. For a moment, Jacob's heart stopped, fearing the worst. But then he saw the rise and fall of the animal's breathing, and he realized Odds was simply sleeping, actually resting instead of standing rigid in the corner. Jacob stood in the doorway, watching the sleeping colt, and felt something loosen in his chest. A knot he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "We're gonna figure this out, Odds," he whispered. "You and me both." Dr. Ellen Reeves arrived exactly at 9 in a white pickup truck with her clinic's name painted on the side. She was a sturdy woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Jacob met her in the driveway, suddenly self-conscious about his trailer, the weeds growing around it, the general air of poverty that hung over his small piece of land. But Dr. Reeves didn't seem to notice or care. She shook his hand firmly and got straight to business. "Show me the animal," she said, grabbing a large veterinary bag from her truck. Jacob led her around back to the shed. "His name is Odds. I've only had him 2 days, got him at the auction. He's wild, like I said on the phone. Won't let anyone touch him yet. But he's been eating and drinking, which seems like a good sign." Dr. Reeves peered into the shed, and Jacob watched her face carefully for signs of judgment or criticism. What he saw instead was professional assessment and something that might have been compassion. She studied Odds for a long moment, taking in the patchy coat, the visible ribs, the way the colt pressed himself against the far wall. "That's a severe case of mange," she said quietly. "Rain rot too, by the looks of it. Poor thing's probably been neglected for months, and he's severely underweight, maybe 200 pounds under where he should be for his age." She turned to Jacob. "How much did you pay for him?" $8. Dr. Reeves let out a long breath. "Well, Mr. Miller, I'll be honest with you. You've got a long road ahead. This animal is going to need consistent treatment for the skin conditions, probably for several months. He'll need proper nutrition, deworming, vaccines. And that's assuming there aren't other underlying health issues we haven't discovered yet. The cost is going to add up." Jacob felt his stomach drop. "How much are we talking?" "For today's examination and initial treatment, probably around 150. But ongoing care, medications, follow-up visits, you're looking at several hundred more over the next few months, maybe more depending on how he responds to treatment." Jacob did the math in his head. Even with Sarah's money, he'd barely have enough to cover today. The rest would have to come from somewhere he didn't have. But looking at Odds standing in that shed, seeing how the colt had started to trust him even just a little bit, Jacob couldn't imagine giving up now. "Let's do what we can do today," he said. "I'll figure out the rest." Dr. Reeves studied him for a moment, and Jacob had the feeling she was seeing more than just the shabby trailer and worn clothes. "All right. First thing is, we need to get close enough to examine him properly. That's going to be the challenge." What followed was nearly an hour of patient, careful work. Dr. Reeves moved with a calm confidence that seemed to settle even Odds' nervous energy. She spoke to the colt in a low, soothing voice, explaining each movement before she made it. Jacob helped as much as he could, following her instructions, learning through observation. Slowly, incredibly slowly, they managed to get a lead rope on Odds and secure him loosely to a post so Dr. Reeves could conduct her examination. The colt trembled through the entire process, his eyes rolling white with fear, but he didn't fight as violently as Jacob had expected. Maybe he was too tired. Maybe he sensed that these humans were trying to help. Or maybe, Jacob thought, Maybe Odds had simply reached a point where he didn't have the strength to resist anymore. Dr. Reeves worked efficiently, checking the colt's vitals, examining his teeth, assessing the extent of the skin damage. Her face remained professionally neutral, but Jacob caught the small frowns, the gentle murmurs of sympathy. When she was done, she administered several injections for parasites and infection, applied a medicated ointment to the worst of the skin lesions, and demonstrated to Jacob how to continue the treatment. "You'll need to apply this ointment twice a day," she explained, handing him a large tube. "It's going to take time for his coat to grow back and for the skin to heal. Keep him on a consistent feeding schedule, gradually increasing the amount so his system can adjust. Make sure he always has clean water. And Mr. Miller, this is important. He needs shelter from the elements. Rain and cold wind will make the skin conditions worse." Jacob looked at his makeshift shed with its gaps in the walls and inadequate roof. "I'll fix it up." Dr. Reeves packed her supplies back into her bag. When she gave him the bill, Jacob counted out the money with hands that shook slightly. He was left with $37 until his next check, which was still a week away. He'd have to make it work somehow. Rice and canned beans. He'd survived on worse. As Dr. Reeves was leaving, she paused at her truck. "Mr. Miller, can I ask you something? Why this horse? You don't have facilities. You're clearly struggling financially. And this animal is going to be a massive investment of time and money with no guarantee of success. So why?" Jacob looked back at the shed where Odds was standing, calmer now, the immediate trauma of the examination fading. "I saw myself in him," he said simply. Nobody wanted him. Everyone had given up. He was $8 away from being put down or left to die on his own, and I just thought, maybe if I could save him, maybe that means something. Maybe that means someone like him or someone like me doesn't have to be thrown away just because we're broken. Dr. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "I'm going to cut you a deal, Mr. Miller. You pay me what you can, when you can. I'll keep providing care as long as you keep trying with him. Deal?" Jacob felt his throat tighten. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just take care of that colt." She climbed into her truck, then rolled down the window. "And Mr. Miller? You're not broken. Neither is he. You're both just healing." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that Jacob hadn't experienced in years. Structure, purpose, a reason to get up every morning that went beyond simply existing. He woke before dawn, made his coffee, and headed straight to the shed to check on Odds. The colt had begun to anticipate his visits, and instead of cowering in the corner, Odds would turn his head toward the door when he heard Jacob's footsteps approaching. It was a small thing, but to Jacob it felt monumental. The twice-daily application of the medicated ointment was a challenge that required patience. Jacob didn't always feel he had. His leg ached constantly from the extra standing and moving, and there were moments when the pain made him sharp and irritable. But he never let that show around Odds. He'd learned in the military how to compartmentalize pain, how to keep moving, even when every nerve in his body screamed for rest. Those lessons served him well now. The first few times he tried to apply the ointment, Odds fought him, not violently, but with a persistent resistance that made the task take 3 times longer than it should have. Jacob would get close, reach out slowly with the ointment on his fingers, and Odds would shift away, ears pinned back, body tense. But Jacob never rushed it. He would pause, talk softly, wait until Odds settled, then try again. Over and over until finally he could touch the raw patches of skin and apply the medicine. After a week, something changed. Jacob entered the shed one morning with the ointment tube in hand, and Odds didn't move away. The colt stood still, watching him with those dark eyes, and when Jacob reached out, Odds flinched but held his ground. Jacob worked quickly, applying the ointment to the worst spots, murmuring encouragement the whole time. When he finished, he stepped back and saw something in Odd's expression that hadn't been there before. Not trust exactly, but maybe the beginning of it. A recognition that Jacob's presence meant relief from the constant itching and pain. "Good boy," Jacob said softly. "You're doing so good, Odds." True to his word, Jacob had been working on improving the shed. With the little money he had left, he'd bought some plastic sheeting and extra boards from the hardware store. He spent his afternoons patching holes, reinforcing walls, making sure the roof didn't leak. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional. Old man Henderson had stopped by one afternoon, having heard through the town grapevine that Jacob had bought a horse. "Let me see this animal you've bankrupted yourself over," Henderson said, not unkindly. Jacob led him to the shed. Henderson peered inside, his weathered face unreadable. Odds stared back at them, his coat still patchy but noticeably improved. The angry red skin was beginning to heal, and in some places new hair was starting to grow in, soft and fuzzy. "Well, I'll be damned," Henderson said after a long moment. "Heard you bought the worst-looking horse at the auction. Thought people were exaggerating." He paused. "They weren't. But I'll tell you what, Miller, he looks better than I would have guessed. You're doing something right." Henderson offered Jacob some work, a week's worth of fence repair on his property, cash under the table. Jacob accepted gratefully, knowing the money would go straight toward feed and medicine. The work was hard, harder than it should have been given his leg, but Jacob pushed through. Every fence post he set, every wire he strung, he thought about Odds waiting back at the trailer, about the trust that was slowly building between them, about how failure wasn't an option because this colt was depending on him. In the evenings, after feeding Odds and applying the ointment, Jacob would sit in his camping chair outside the shed door and just be present. Sometimes he talked about his day, his voice low and conversational. Sometimes he talked about the war, things he'd never told anyone, not even the VA counselor he'd seen twice before deciding it wasn't for him. Odds would stand near the door, closer than he used to, and listen. Jacob knew the colt couldn't understand the words, but there was something therapeutic about speaking them aloud anyway, about having a listener who didn't judge or offer unwanted advice or look at him with pity. "You know what the hardest part is?" Jacob said one evening, watching the sun set behind the distant mountains. "It's not the physical stuff, the leg, the pain, all that I can handle. It's the feeling that I don't matter anymore, that I'm just taking up space in a world that's moved on without me." He paused, running his hand along the rough wood of the shed wall. "But when I'm here with you, taking care of you, making sure you're okay, I feel like maybe I do matter. Like maybe I've got something to offer after all." Odds took a step closer to the door, close enough that if Jacob extended his hand, he could touch the colt's muzzle. He did, slowly, and Odds didn't pull away. The colt's breath was warm against his palm, and Jacob felt something break open inside him. Not in a painful way, but like a dam finally releasing pressure it had been holding too long. By the third week, Odds was gaining weight. His ribs were still visible, but no longer protruding quite so sharply. The skin condition was healing steadily, patches of healthy coat appearing like islands in a sea of damaged skin. Dr. Reeves came by for a follow-up visit and nodded approvingly at the progress. "You've done well, Mr. Miller," she said. "Really well. Keep doing exactly what you're doing." After she left, Jacob stood in the shed with Odds, feeling a pride he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. This wild, broken colt that nobody wanted was getting better, was healing. And somehow, in taking care of Odds, Jacob was beginning to heal too. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping across Montana with a cold that seemed to seep into everything. Jacob woke one morning to find frost coating the windows of his trailer and his breath visible in the air inside. The first thing he thought about wasn't his own discomfort, but Odds. He pulled on an extra layer of clothes, grabbed the feed bucket, and hurried outside, his legs stiff from the cold. In the shed, Odds stood with his head lowered, steam rising from his nostrils. Jacob's improved shelter was keeping out the worst of the wind, but it wasn't enough for the brutal cold that had settled in. The Colt's coat, still growing back in patches, wasn't providing adequate insulation. Jacob could see him shivering slightly, and the sight sent a spike of worry through his chest. "Damn it," Jacob muttered, looking around the shed. He needed to do something, and fast. He went back to his trailer and grabbed the only spare blanket he had, an old military-issue wool blanket he'd kept from his service days. It wasn't a horse blanket, but it would have to work. Getting it onto Odds was another matter entirely. Jacob approached slowly with the blanket folded over his arm. Odds had gotten used to Jacob's presence, even begun to seek it out, but this was something new and potentially frightening. The Colt's ears flicked forward with interest, then back with suspicion as Jacob drew near. Jacob talked him through it, explaining what he was doing as if Odds could understand every word. "I know this is going to feel weird, buddy, but you need it. Can't have you freezing out here." It took 20 minutes of patient work, but eventually Jacob managed to drape the blanket over Odds' back and secure it with some rope threaded through the corners. It wasn't pretty, and a real horseman would probably laugh at the makeshift arrangement. But Odds stopped shivering. The Colt turned his head to sniff at the blanket, then looked at Jacob with what could only be described as gratitude. That same day, Jacob made a decision. He called his daughter again, something that was becoming slightly less uncomfortable with each conversation. Sarah answered on the second ring this time, her voice warmer than it used to be. "Hey, Dad. How's the horse?" "He's doing better, getting stronger. But winter's here and I'm worried about him. I need to winterize the shelter better and I'm running low on feed. I hate to ask again, but how much do you need?" They talked for longer than usual that day. Sarah asked about Odds, really asked, wanting details about his recovery and personality. Jacob found himself opening up, telling her about the small victories, the way Odds now greeted him each morning, how the Colt would follow him around the small paddock area Jacob had fenced off. Sarah listened, and in her voice Jacob heard something he hadn't heard in years. Pride. His daughter was proud of him. "Dad, I've been thinking," Sarah said before they hung up. "Maybe I could come visit. In the spring, when the weather's better. I'd like to meet Odds." Jacob felt his throat tighten. "I'd like that, sweetheart. I'd like that a lot." With the money Sarah sent, Jacob bought proper insulation for the shed, more hay, and a real horse blanket that actually fit Odds properly. He spent 3 days working on the shelter, his hands numb from the cold, his legs screaming with every movement. But when he was done, the shed was truly weatherproof, a proper home for a recovering horse. Odds watched the work with interest, and when Jacob finally finished and stood back to admire his handiwork, the Colt walked over and bumped his shoulder gently with his nose. It was the first time Odds had initiated physical contact, and Jacob stood frozen, not wanting to move and break the moment. Slowly, he raised his hand and scratched behind Odds' ear. The Colt leaned into the touch, eyes half closing with pleasure. Something in Jacob's chest loosened even further, another knot of isolation and pain coming undone. As winter deepened, the bond between them strengthened. Jacob began spending more time in the paddock with Odds, teaching him to walk on a lead rope, getting him accustomed to being handled all over his body. The Colt was a quick learner, eager to please in a way that surprised Jacob. Beneath the wildness and fear, there was an intelligence and willingness that spoke of breeding, of genetics that suggested Odds came from better stock than his appearance at the auction would have indicated. One afternoon, Henderson stopped by again. He stood at the fence watching Jacob work with Odds, his experienced eye taking in every detail. When Jacob finally noticed him and walked over, Henderson was nodding slowly. "You know, Miller, I've been around horses my whole life. Bred them, trained them, sold them. And I've got to say, there's something special about that colt." He pointed at Odds, who was standing calmly now, his coat nearly fully grown back. "The way he moves, the shape of him under all that trauma he went through, I'd bet money he's got quarter horse in him, maybe even some thoroughbred. Good bloodlines." Jacob looked at Odds with new eyes. He'd been so focused on keeping the colt alive and helping him heal that he hadn't really thought about what Odds might become. "You think so?" "I know so. And I'll tell you something else. The way you've brought him back from nothing, the trust you've built, that's the foundation of a real partnership. You keep working with him, and that colt could be something special. Maybe even competition quality." After Henderson left, Jacob stood in the paddock with Odds, processing what he'd heard. Competition, championship, words that seemed to belong to a different world, one where people had money and resources and didn't live in rusted trailers. But looking at Odds, seeing how far they'd both come, Jacob allowed himself to wonder, what if Henderson was right? What if this $8 colt that nobody wanted could actually be something extraordinary? "What do you say, Odds?" Jacob asked, running his hand along the colt's now healthy neck. "Want to show them all what we're made of?" Odds nickered softly and pressed his head against Jacob's chest, and in that moment, Jacob felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just hope, but genuine belief in the possibility of something better. Spring came late but welcome, melting the snow and bringing new life to the Montana landscape. Odds had transformed completely over the winter months. His coat had grown in thick and glossy, a beautiful dark bay that caught the sunlight and revealed the quality Henderson had suspected. He'd gained muscle and weight, no longer the skeletal creature from the auction, but a strong, healthy yearling. More than that, his eyes had changed. The wild terror was gone, replaced by an alert intelligence and a trust in Jacob that ran deep. Jacob had changed too, though the transformation was less visible. His legs still hurt, probably always would, but he'd grown stronger from the daily work with Odds. The nightmares came less frequently now, and on the nights when they did visit, he would go sit with Odds in the pre-dawn darkness, finding comfort in the colt's steady breathing and warm presence. The isolation that had defined his life for years had cracked open, letting in not just Odds but other connections too. Sarah called weekly now, and Henderson stopped by regularly to check on their progress. One morning in early April, Henderson arrived with a trailer hitched to his truck. "Get Odds ready," he called out as he climbed from the cab. "We're going to my place." Jacob looked up from mucking out the shed, confused. "Why? What's happening?" "You've done good work with him, Miller, but he needs proper training now. Real arena work. I've got the facilities, and I'm going to teach you both what you need to know." Henderson's expression was serious. "That colt's got potential, but potential doesn't mean anything without proper development. If you're serious about this, about seeing what he can really do, then you need to let me help." Jacob's pride wanted to refuse, wanted to insist he could figure it out on his own. But his practical side, the part that had kept him alive in Afghanistan, knew Henderson was offering something invaluable. He swallowed his ego and nodded. "All right, let me get him." Loading Odds into the trailer was easier than Jacob had imagined it would be. The colt trusted him now, trusted him enough to follow him into the confined space, even though it clearly made him nervous. Jacob stayed with him the whole ride to Henderson's ranch, talking softly, keeping him calm. When they arrived and unloaded, Odds' eyes went wide at the sight of Henderson's facilities. A proper arena with good footing, round pen, multiple paddocks, other horses in the distance. It was a different world from Jacob's patched-together setup. Henderson wasted no time. He handed Jacob a lunge line and began instructing him on proper groundwork techniques, how to read Odd's body language, how to communicate through pressure and release, how to build respect without breaking spirit. Jacob absorbed everything like a man dying of thirst drinks water. He'd thought he'd been doing well with Odds, and he had, but now he realized how much he didn't know. "Watch his inside ear," Henderson called as Jacob worked Odds in the round pen. "See how it's focused on you? That's what you want. He's listening, waiting for your cue. Now ask him to change direction." "Good. See how smooth that was? That's because he trusts you." They worked for hours. Jacob's leg throbbed mercilessly, but he ignored it, too focused on learning to care about pain. Odds moved through the exercises with a grace that surprised both men. His transitions were clean, his attention focused, and there was a power in his stride that suggested speed and athleticism. When Henderson asked him to canter, Odds moved with a fluidity that took Jacob's breath away. "That colt can run," Henderson said, his voice holding a note of excitement Jacob had never heard before. "I mean really run. You see how he collected himself coming around that turn, how balanced he stayed. That's not something you can teach. That's natural talent." Over the following weeks, they fell into a routine. 3 times a week, Jacob would trailer Odds to Henderson's ranch for training sessions. Henderson taught Jacob everything he knew about working with young horses, and Jacob proved to be a dedicated student. His military background served him well. He understood discipline, consistency, the importance of clear communication and follow-through. Odds responded to this structured approach, blossoming under the combination of Jacob's patient love and Henderson's expert guidance. One afternoon, Henderson suggested something that made Jacob's stomach flip. "There's a small horse show next month over in Billings, nothing fancy, just local stuff. Some halter classes, some pleasure classes for green horses. I think you should enter Odds." Jacob stared at him. "I've never been to a horse show in my life. I wouldn't know what I was doing." "So, you didn't know what you were doing when you bought him either, and look how that turned out." Henderson crossed his arms. "Miller, you've got a good horse here, a really good horse. But he needs experience, needs to see different places, different horses, different situations. And honestly, you need it too. You need to get out there, be part of something bigger than just you and him in that shed." The idea terrified Jacob. Being around crowds, being judged, putting himself and Odds out there for evaluation. But underneath the fear was something else. Excitement. The possibility of proving that this $8 colt was worth something, that Jacob himself was worth something. "I'll think about it," he said, but they both knew he'd already decided. That night, Jacob sat with Odds in the paddock, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The colt stood beside him, occasionally lowering his head to crop grass, comfortable and content. Jacob thought about how far they'd come from that day at the auction, about the connection they'd built through patience and mutual healing, about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, their story was bigger than survival. Maybe it was about triumph. "Henderson wants us to go to a show next month," Jacob said to Odds. "What do you think? Ready to show the world what you can do?" Odds raised his head and nickered softly, and Jacob chose to interpret that as yes. The month leading up to the show passed in a blur of preparation and nervous energy. Jacob worked with Odds every single day, drilling the basics until they became second nature. Henderson coached him on show etiquette, ring patterns, how to present a horse to judges. Jacob bought a used pair of boots and his first real Western shirt from the thrift store, spending money he probably shouldn't have, but knowing he needed to look presentable. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about showing respect for Odds, for all the work they'd both put in. The night before the show, Jacob couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through everything that could go wrong. Odds could spook at the unfamiliar environment. Jacob could forget the pattern and embarrass them both. The other competitors would take one look at this veteran with his limp and his scarred $8 horse and laugh them out of the arena. The anxiety built until he finally gave up on sleep, pulled on his clothes, and went outside. Odds was awake too, standing alert in his paddock, as if sensing Jacob's nervous energy. When Jacob approached, the colt walked over immediately and pressed his forehead against Jacob's chest in the gesture that had become their private ritual. Jacob wrapped his arms around Odds's neck and breathed in the familiar smell of horse and hay and spring grass. "I'm scared," Jacob admitted quietly. "I'm scared we're going to fail. That people are going to see us and think we don't belong there. That I've been fooling myself thinking you could be something special." He paused, feeling the steady rhythm of Odds' breathing. "But you know what? Even if we go there tomorrow and come in dead last, even if everyone laughs at us, it doesn't change what we've done. Doesn't change that you were dying and now you're alive. That you were broken and now you're whole. That matters more than any ribbon ever could." Odds lifted his head and looked at Jacob with those deep, intelligent eyes. In them, Jacob saw no fear, no doubt. Just trust. Just belief. The colt believed in him completely, and maybe that was enough. They left before dawn the next morning, Henderson following in his truck to provide support. The 2-hour drive to Billings gave Jacob too much time to think. But Odds traveled calmly in the trailer, and that steadiness helped Jacob find his own center. By the time they pulled into the showgrounds, the sun was fully up and the place was already buzzing with activity. Horse trailers lined the parking area, horses and riders everywhere, people in crisp show clothes moving with practiced efficiency. Jacob's hands shook slightly as he unloaded Odds. The colt stepped off the trailer and his head went high, ears swiveling to take in all the new sights and sounds. For a moment, Jacob feared Odds might revert to his old wild panic, but then the colt looked at him and settled, trusting Jacob to guide him through this strange new world. They had signed up for 2 classes. Yearling halter, where horses were judged on conformation and presentation, and a green horse pleasure class for horses with limited showing experience. The halter class was first. Henderson helped Jacob groom Odds until his coat gleamed like polished mahogany. The patches where hair had once been missing were now completely filled in, and unless someone knew to look for it, there was no sign of the disease that had once ravaged the colt's skin. Standing at the gate waiting for their class to be called, Jacob watched the other horses. They were beautiful, clearly expensive animals with professional handlers. He saw the looks people gave him and Odds, the curiosity, the subtle dismissal. He recognized that look. It was the same one people gave him when they found out he was a veteran living in a trailer, struggling to get by. The look that said, "You don't belong here." Then their number was called, and it was time. Jacob led Odds into the arena, his heart hammering so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. The sand under his feet felt foreign. The judge's eyes felt like spotlights, and for a moment his vision narrowed with the old familiar anxiety that used to precede panic attacks. But then he felt the lead rope in his hand, felt Odds walking beside him steady and sure, and something clicked. They moved together around the arena in the pattern Henderson had taught them, Odds stride even and ground covering. When it came time to set up for the judge's inspection, Jacob positioned Odds exactly as Henderson had drilled into him, and the colt stood square and proud, head up, ears forward. The judge walked around them, examining Odds from every angle. Jacob couldn't read the woman's expression, but he saw her pause at Odds' hip, running her hand along the muscling there. She made notes on her clipboard and moved to the next horse. They didn't win. When the placings were announced, they got 4th place out of 8, but when Jacob led Odds up to collect their white ribbon, 4th place felt like a victory. The judge handed it to him with a smile. "Nice horse," she said. "Good bone structure. Excellent muscling for his age. Keep working with him." Those words, that small validation, meant more to Jacob than any trophy could have. Someone who knew horses, someone who judged them professionally, thought Odds was good. Not just okay, but actually good. The pleasure class was later in the afternoon. By then, both Jacob and Odds had relaxed into the show environment. This class required more skill, asking the horses to walk and trot under saddle. Since Odds wasn't saddle-trained yet, they'd entered the in-hand division where Jacob would guide him through the gates on the lead line. This time, something magical happened. Odds moved like he'd been born for this, his trot suspended and flowing, his transition smooth as silk. Jacob felt like they were dancing, connected by something deeper than just a lead rope. When the judge called for an extended trot, Odds opened up his stride and heads turned to watch them pass. Jacob heard someone whisper, "Look at that horse move." When the announcer called second place with their number, Jacob actually wondered if he'd heard wrong. But no, they were calling them forward, and Henderson was grinning from the rail, and Jacob was accepting a red ribbon while tears threatened to spill from his eyes. Word spread quickly through the small Montana horse community about the veteran and his $8 Colt. People who'd been at the Billings show talked about the bay yearling that moved like a dream, about the quiet man with the limp who'd brought him back from the edge of death. Henderson fielded calls from people wanting to know more, wanting to see this remarkable horse for themselves. Some offered to buy Odds outright, substantial amounts of money that would have solved Jacob's financial struggles in an instant. He turned them all down without hesitation. Over the next year, Jacob and Odds continued to train and compete. They added more ribbons to the collection that now hung in Jacob's trailer, a rainbow of achievement that represented countless hours of work and unwavering dedication. But more than the ribbons, what mattered was the journey itself. Every morning when Jacob went out to feed Odds, every training session where they pushed each other to improve, every quiet evening they spent together, watching the sunset, these moments had rebuilt Jacob from the inside out. The nightmares had stopped almost entirely now. The isolation that once felt like a prison had transformed into solitude that felt like peace. He'd found purpose again, found something to care about beyond his own survival. His relationship with Sarah had healed too, strengthened by their weekly phone calls where he told her stories about Odds and she told him about her life. She'd promised to visit in the spring, and as that time approached, Jacob found himself actually looking forward to it instead of dreading it. When Sarah finally did come, driving up in her sedan on a bright May morning, Jacob felt nervous in a different way than he used to. Not the anxiety of disappointing her, but the eager anticipation of sharing something he was proud of. She stepped out of the car, older now than when he'd last seen her in person, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Then she smiled, really smiled, and crossed the distance to hug him. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, sweetheart. I'm glad you're here." Jacob showed her everything. The trailer he'd cleaned specially for her visit, the shed-turned stable that was now actually decent, the paddock where Odds spent his days. When Sarah first saw the horse, she stopped and caught her breath. Odds stood in the morning light, his coat gleaming, his body powerful and healthy. He was nothing like the wretched creature Jacob had described to her a year ago. "Dad, he's beautiful," Sarah said, her voice full of wonder. "I can't believe this is the same horse." Jacob called to Odds, and the horse walked over immediately, greeting Jacob with their customary forehead-to-chest press, before turning curious eyes to Sarah. She reached out tentatively, and Odds sniffed her hand, then allowed her to stroke his neck. Jacob watched his daughter connect with the animal that had saved his life in ways she might never fully understand, and something in him felt complete. That afternoon, they went to Henderson's ranch so Sarah could watch Jacob work with Odds. Henderson had set up a small course of obstacles, and Jacob guided odds through them with the easy confidence of true partnership. Sarah stood at the rail with Henderson, and Jacob heard her ask, "Has my dad always been this good with horses?" Henderson chuckled. "Your dad's never worked with horses before odds. Everything he knows he learned in the last year. But he's got something you can't teach. Heart. And that horse of his, he's got it too. That's why they work so well together." After the session, as they walked odds to cool him down, Sarah asked the question Jacob had been waiting for. "So what's next for you two? Are you going to keep showing?" Jacob ran his hand along Odd's neck, considering. "There's a big regional championship in August. Henderson thinks we should go for it. The competition will be tough. Real professionals with expensive horses. But you know what? I think we should try. Not because we need to prove anything to anyone else anymore, but because I want to see how far we can go. How far this $8 horse that nobody wanted can take us." Sarah smiled. "I'll be there. I want to watch." The regional championship came on a hot August day, and Jacob arrived with odds more prepared than he'd ever been. Henderson had coached them relentlessly, and odds had matured into a stunning 2-year-old with presence and athleticism that drew eyes wherever they went. The competition was fierce, exactly as Henderson had warned. Professional trainers with strings of expensive horses, serious money, and serious talent. When Jacob led odds into the arena for the final class, he felt no fear, just gratitude. Gratitude for the second chance this horse had given him, for the purpose and connection and healing they'd found together. They moved through their pattern with precision and grace, odds responding to Jacob's subtle cues like they were one being instead of two. The trot work was flawless, the transitions seamless, and when they finished, Jacob knew they'd given their absolute best. Standing in the center of the arena waiting for the results, Jacob looked up into the stands where Sarah sat with Henderson. She was watching him with pride shining clearly on her face. Whatever happened next, he'd already won. He'd won the moment he'd chosen to save this horse, the moment he'd chosen to save himself. When the announcer called their number for first place, for champion, the arena erupted in applause. Jacob stood frozen for a moment, unable to quite believe it. Then Odds bumped his shoulder as if to say, "Come on, let's go get our prize," and Jacob laughed through the tears that were streaming down his face. They walked forward to accept the championship trophy, this broken veteran and his $8 Colt, and prove to everyone watching that nothing and no one should ever be counted out, that with patience, dedication, and love, the most unlikely partnerships can achieve the most extraordinary things. That being broken doesn't mean being finished. As Jacob held the trophy with one hand and stroked Odds with the other, he thought about that day at the auction, about how close he'd come to walking away, about how easily this horse could have died unnamed and unmourned, about how saving Odds had ultimately saved him too. Against all odds, they'd made it together,